Today on Muddy Gear's 4x4, the trail plug gets some custom-made front tube fenders. Alright, well the first step of any project like this is to make a template. So I just took some cardboard, laid it out against the fender here, and just kind of crudely drew it out just from underneath with a Sharpie, and I cut it out to my basic length. This will give me a template that I can now lay out on some sheet metal to cut out. Now, I always like to make my template, as you can see it's not perfect, but I always like to make my template actually just a little on the big side. The reason for that is when I cut this thing out of steel, it'll give me some room to, I can grind or cut or whatever, to give me some room to make this fit perfectly. If I try to make it too close, what could happen is you might make something just a little bit too small or cut it just a little too short, and that's something that I don't want. I'd much rather it be just a little bit big. I can go back and grind it and make it perfect later. Now, one thing I do want to mention with this, as I'm going to take my template off really quickly here, one thing to consider for my front tube fenders is when I cut these things originally to gain clearance, I cut them all the way up to this body line, which I think is, a fairly normal thing for a lot of Cherokee guys to do. The problem with that is that I want to be able to run my tube fender across this distance, and I don't really have anything here left to weld to. So when I made my template, I can show you here, I actually made it to where it's actually about an inch longer here. That way I still have something to actually weld my sheet metal across to, and my tube. So underneath here I'm gonna have to figure out some way to kind of support that, but I'll figure out something to do with that. That way I can also make sure that this bolts to this nice and securely as well. And so I did make this about 1 inch wider here, just so I actually have something to weld to, otherwise I wouldn't. But now I'm gonna go ahead and take this template, throw it down on my sheet metal and cut it out, and see if we can't get this project even further. Alright, well there you go. I got my piece of sheet metal all cut out. So this is a piece of 10 gauge sheet metal, so it's basically 1/8 inch. I think it might be a little bit wider than 1/8 inch. And I just did it with my angle grinder. So it takes a long time to do it, a little bit of a steady hand, and definitely a lot of mess, but you can totally do it with an angle grinder. And if you see, it fits up here pretty good. So this is the exact reason why I put it, I always cut it a little bit long, so I definitely have a little bit of trimming here to do along the line here. But as far as, I don't know if you're going to be able to see the actual fender, you can't really, but it follows it pretty darn well all the way through the edge here. And then this right here by the door, obviously the body line is not straight here. It kind of makes a curve like around the contour of the door. So if I push this straight on here, you can see that this piece is straight, but the door's not. So I'm gonna have to, kind of grind this down to make it fit just right, so that it actually bolts to the body line or lines up with the body line perfectly. Now this piece here, so I said that I had to do about 1 inch, wider, so that I actually had a space to, weld the actual fender, the tube fender, when I go to make this thing. So if you notice here, it's a little flimsy. I do need to figure out some kind of way that I'm going to be able to bolt this all down. So something up underneath here, I'm thinking making a bracket, possibly like right here, that I can kind of just bolt in that goes across, so that I can bolt this down. That way I know this thing's going to be nice and secure. But for the most part, what I got to do is some grinding to make this thing fit better and make sure all my lines are smooth and all that stuff to make it look good. But then I can get this thing pretty well mocked up, and I should be able to start drilling the holes to figure out how I'm going to mount this thing. Alright, well check it out. The first step of my quarter panel armor and tube fenders is complete. So I got everything pretty much cut out, ground down into shape. and I'm liking the way that it looks. I even went ahead and drilled my holes for my mounting hardware. Those are just 1/4 inch because I'm using 1/4 inch button head bolts, and it's about ready to mount, at least for the test fit. But before I show you that, there's one quick thing. So I think I came up with a solution for my lack of material here, because I had already cut my fenders so tall. Again, I didn't have an area to mount my new tube fenders to. There's just nothing here to mount it to. So this is what I came up with. If you look inside here in the inner fender, there's like this perfectly square shape here that's kind of two-sided, like the steel is actually squished together, so there's 2 layers of it, so it's nice and firm. So I figured, hey, that would be a great mounting spot. So this is what I came up with. It's just a bracket, and essentially it's just a piece of 1/8 inch with some angle iron and then a piece of 1x1, and it's just going to fit up in there, and it's going to bolt in and essentially just go across the fender like this, which will provide a mounting surface for my new tube fender. And I think what's a benefit is that it actually is going to add, I think, a lot more strength and rigidity, because I actually want to use these tube fenders. I mean, if I'm bumping them off of rocks and trees and stuff like that, you know, these fenders are kind of flimsy. But with this, I think I'm going to give it actually some extra strength. So I think it's going to be a good solution. So I need to go ahead and mount, at least temporarily, my armor to my fender here, and that way I can actually get to the next phase of my project, which is bending the pipe to actually make my tube fender. Alright, well, check it out. I got the beginnings of my tube fender all bolted up and on the front end of my Jeep, and I am liking what this looks like. I think these things are going to turn out really well. But now I need to do the hard part, which is actually making the tube part of the fender. And for that, I'm going to be using this Harbor Freight pipe bender with just some 1-inch Schedule 40 pipe. Nothing too fancy, but I think the best strategy here is that I wanted to figure out what my endpoints were going to be. So I decided, you know, just kind of eyeballed what I thought would look good, and I measured it out and centered it out, and I made a mark. So this is where I want the rear part of the fender to terminate, is right here. So I needed to know that endpoint, and then I just did the same thing for the front. I figured it out, marked it out, centered it out, and that's where I want the front part of the tube fender to terminate. And so the next part is that I wanted to figure out where I was going to actually start my bend, where I wanted the bend to start the curvature here of the fender. And so I kind of just made marks right where it seemed like the flat part ended and it just started its bend. So I made a mark here and a mark here, and I measured in between them, which I got about 23.5 inches. So that's where I want my bends to be on the pipe. And then I just came here. Not sure if you can see my marks, but I made a mark here, and then I made a mark down here at 23.5 inches. So that's where my two bends are going to be. And then I just did a couple marks about 1/2 inch apart. And what I'm going to do is just slowly move the pipe in and change the radius of the bend, so I can just slowly move this thing and bend it. And I tend to get the best results when using this thing. I'm not going to go over all my tips that I do on this, because I've done this on several of my other past videos, but if you are really interested in using one of these Harbor Freight benders, our buddy over at his new channel, Nate, at Dirt Lifestyle, actually did an entire video of tips and tricks of how to use one of these things. That's pretty good, so I'll leave a link in the description. You should go check out his new channel. But I'm going to go ahead and start getting this thing bent. So I'm just going to start here and just slowly move the radius over and over, probably pull this thing out, just really every once in a while checking to make sure that everything's looking good, just slowly, 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 so I can make sure that this thing looks the way that I want. So again, I want this thing to curve and terminate right about there. And so I'm just going to keep test fitting until I find that curve. So let's start bending. Alright, well that's starting to look like a tube fender now. So I got my piece of pipe welded on here, and what I found was it was easier, when I'm doing this by myself and I don't have an extra set of hands, I found it was easier to take it off the vehicle, lay it out on the bench, and what I did was I had this piece of 3-inch by 1/8 inch, which is literally the same diameter of the skin that I want to make. I found it in my my metal pile here, and I laid it down, and I just tack welded it to the frame, or to the fender, and that way I knew I could get my pipe nice and straight and level, like I wanted it. And so that actually was like a good little template for me, a good little guide to make sure that when I welded this on, that it would be nice and flat across the surface. And so I was able to just pop that off. And another thing is, when I was making my pie cuts here, I actually made this, when I cut it, I didn't quite cut enough. But on this side I did. And so I was shooting for about 3 inches to come off the fender. Well, here it's 3 inches. And here, when I was laying it out and test fitting it, I was only getting about 2.5. And so I could have fixed it. That was a bit of a mistake, but it turns out to be I'm going to call a Bob Ross mistake, a happy little mistake, because as I was looking at it, I actually was like, I like this. I think it looks cool. So it's not very noticeable, but it does kind of curve in slightly, almost like a dove nose a little bit. And you know, I could have fixed it and made it uniform 3 inch all the way across, but now that I look at it, I think it looks really cool. And so I kept it. It was one of those things that just turned out as a design that I ended up liking it. So I think the biggest thing is replicating it on the other side. And then I also made these cross pieces. I cut the tops off the piece of the pipe, that way my skin will lay nice and flat over this. So there's my tube fender, and it's looking pretty good. So the next thing that I did here was I made a cardboard template so that I can actually make the skin now for my fender. And I just laid the cardboard out here. And so now I can actually go and trace this out onto a piece of 1/8 inch steel, the same thickness as the actual armor here, and I can get it laid out. So let's go ahead and cut that out. Alright, well there's my piece of metal that I'm going to use for my skin. So obviously I got some grinding work to do and some shaping work to do. But I think what I'm going to do to make it curve around these edges, I've done this before in previous projects, but I'll just make a little notch on the underside here, and I'll be able to bend the metal down easier. So I think what I have to do is kind of figure it out where I'm going to make my notches. I'll probably start at the end here. So I'll just match these up, start making my notches. I'll probably have to do, again, some little grinding and some forming and stuff. But as I do that, once I get it to start to fit right, I can just start tacking into place, tacking into place, tacking into place, getting it bent further and further down so I can get this skin to now fit over the tube fender. Now that is one cool looking tube fender. So with just a little bit of reworking with the grinder, a lot of bending, a lot of clamps, and a lot of tack welds, I got my tube fender all pretty much ready to go here. So I think really the last step, honestly, is to get this thing unbolted. I got to finish welding it. I'm going to take my time, go nice and slow, do it section by section so I don't get any kind of warping. And then I should be able to get it all painted up and get it ready for final install. Well, here they are, some custom-made front tube fenders using just 10 gauge steel and some 1-inch pipe. You know, I'm really happy with the way they came out, especially because, well, I built them and I take pride in that. And you know, they are just solid. I think they look good. It turned out really well, so I'm very happy. So if you liked the video, please make sure you give it a thumbs up, and you should also click subscribe. If you are really a fan of Muddy Beards 4x4, you need to check out the link in the description to this video to our new website where we have all kinds of Muddy Beards merchandise, stickers, t-shirts, hoodies, including this design, the America Muddy Beards. So you need to go check that out. Buy a sweatshirt, buy a t-shirt. It really helps us out, and I think it looks really cool. So anyway, thanks for watching the video, and we will see you on the trail.